Module 12.0 Project Procurement Management Module Overview. Project procurement management includes the processes necessary to purchase or acquire products, services or results needed from outside the project team. Project procurement management includes the management and control processes required to develop and administer agreements such as contracts, purchase orders, memoranda of agreements or MOAs, or internal service level agreements SLAs. The personnel authorised to procure the goods and/or services required for the project may be members of the project team, management or part of the organisation's purchasing department if applicable, as from PMBOK Guide page 459. So what are we going to cover on this module? 12.0 Project Procurement Management Module Overview, which is this video of course. 12.1 Plan Procurement Management, the process of documenting project procurement decisions, specifying the approach and identifying potential sellers. 12.2 Conduct Procurements, the process of obtaining seller responses, selecting a seller and awarding a contract. 12.3 Control Procurements, the process of managing procurement relationships, monitoring contract performance, making changes and corrections as appropriate, and closing out contracts. Key concepts for project procurement management. It pays to remember that the PMBOK Guide was developed as a result of gigantic projects such as the Apollo mission, and in the exam you can assume, unless it clearly says otherwise, that it's a small project, the question is framed around huge projects. This has many implications, but mainly it means that the project team will be very large. The project will be running for many years and it will be able to perform all the processes and sub-processes recommended by the PMBOK Guide. You will have an entire library of lessons learned and historical records that you can peruse before and during your project. Your organisation will also have its own legal department and of course its own procurement department. One of the biggest mistakes you can make on an exam is to answer the questions as if you're working on one of your usual projects. Even if you do work on gigantic multi-year projects, your organisation is unlikely to do everything the way PMBOK Guide recommends. The process is concerned with procurement, which means buying or leasing usually. Even if you work in procurement, you will find there's still a lot to learn. But one of the most basic things you need to realise is the importance of procurement from a legal point of view. You'll be working with contracts and agreements which are largely enforceable by law. Contracts always are enforceable by law. Agreements are sometimes, but obviously if the agreement is with another department of your own organisation, that is not enforceable by law. And you need to know about penalties for non-conformance, performance and quality issues. And although many documents require authorisation in a project, contracts require extra levels of security because of their legally enforceable nature. When you sign a contract for a project, when you sign a contract for a product, service or result, you may just think of it as a record which will file somewhere until it has been paid. And thoughts of battling vendors or customers to the courts is not something you would actually think about. But it happens. You need to be aware of it and you need to know what to do to ensure things don't go wrong, and you need to know what to do when they do go wrong. But you also need to do what you can to protect the organisation. Two other big tips for the exam are A, unless the exam says clearly otherwise, you are an employee of the organisation, you're not a vendor. B, unless the exam says clearly otherwise, you are the buyer, not the seller. As a project manager, you need to have some legal knowledge and a working knowledge of procurement. If you don't, you won't be able to manage the processes or make detailed decisions. The procurement terms used in different countries and even different states or regions will vary, but generally the processes will be very similar to the ones used in the PMBOK Guide. But especially when working with international procurement, you need to confirm what some of the terms mean. Terms can also differ by area in the organisation. For example, an agreement might mean a contract, a service level agreement, an understanding, a memorandum of agreement, or a purchase order. I was managing a large software development project for a very large organisation some years ago. When I was interviewed for the job, they asked a lot of questions about my knowledge of procurement. As a practicing project manager and as a PMP trainer and as a project management course developer, I had a good knowledge of the PMBOK Guide procurement knowledge areas and answered the questions based on that. The interviewers were obviously pleased and impressed, and I got the job, of course. On my first project, I needed to procure the services of a specialist software company for 2 to 3 years. The sponsor asked me to create the request for quote document set, hold a bidder conference and put the quote out on the market, shortlist the 3 bidders, then chair the selection panel to choose one. I said, we have a procurement department, I thought they would do this. But he said, no, they don't get involved in that type of procurement. So I did all of the above and procured the specialist team, and I learned a lot of interesting lessons along the way. It's great to learn stuff from the PMBOK Guide, but even better when you see it working out in the wild. Then we needed a server farm, which is a big group of special expensive computers connected together. Again, the sponsor told me to do all the procurement. Again, I asked if the procurement department could do it, and again he said, no, they don't get involved in that type of procurement. I couldn't get a straight answer from him when I asked what type of procurement they actually did get involved in, and he said they were very busy anyway, so it's best I do it. And he also said, plus the fact whenever they do procurement, they tend to stuff things up, and I want to get things done right in this project. So okay, I did the procurement. After I left the company, I discovered that the procurement department was just 2 people, 1 procurement expert and an assistant. The company had downsized the department from 8 people to save money as the company was making a loss, and these people were constantly overloaded with work. And that was why management had asked me so many procurement related questions in the interview, because they needed project managers to do all their own procurement. The project manager is typically not authorised to sign legal agreements binding the organisation. That's an important one for the examination. This is reserved for those who have the authority to do so. Procurement is an area that you need to tailor to the project. On a large and significant project, it makes sense to follow all the recommended steps because mistakes at this level can be so severe to an organisation and career-ending for a project manager. But at the other end of the scale, if you're procuring a $50 software application or employing casual labour for a few hours, only a minimal process can be justified. The PMBOK Guide says the contracting approach and the contract itself should reflect the simplicity or complexity of the deliverables or required effort and should be written in a manner that complies with local, national and international laws regarding contracts. A contract should clearly state the deliverables and the results expected, including any knowledge transfer from the seller to the buyer. It's a mistake to assume anything on a contract. Anything not in the contract cannot be legally enforced. You need to read all the small print. Even if there's 10 pages of it, you still need to read it. Imagine, for example, a company contracts a website developer to create a company website. Generally, website developers do not implement the website on the internet. It's the buyer's responsibility to procure an internet service, to install the website and so on. Another typical mistake is to buy a project home from a catalogue and expect the finished home to have a landscape garden, the same as the photo in the catalogue. The buyer-seller relationship may exist at many levels on any one project and between organisation, internal and external, to the acquiring organisation. The PMBOK Guide says, depending on the application area, the seller may be identified as a contractor, vendor, service provider or supplier. The buyer may be the owner of the final product, a subcontractor, the acquiring organisation, a service requester or the purchaser. A seller can be viewed during the contract life cycle, first as a bidder, then as a selected source, and then as a contracted supplier or vendor. The winning bidder may manage the work as a project, and often they will manage the work as a project from their side. In such cases, the buyer becomes a customer to the subcontractors, suppliers and service providers, and is therefore a key project stakeholder from the seller's perspective. The seller's project management team may be concerned with all the processes involved in performing the work or providing the services. Terms and conditions of the contract and the procurement statement of work, the SOW, become key inputs to many of the seller's management processes. The contract can actually contain the inputs, e.g. major deliverables, key milestones, cost objectives, or it can limit the project team's options. For example, buyer approval of staffing decisions is often required on IT integration projects. The procurement statement of work may have other names, such as the technical statement of work. The seller itself may become a buyer of lower tiered products, services and materials from the subcontractors and suppliers. In international contracting, the legal jurisdiction under which the contracts will be administered are clearly spelled out in the contract. In most cases, the seller is an external contractor who is bound by a formal contractual relationship. So what are the trends and emerging practices in procurement management? These would include advances in procurement tools. There's been significant improvement in the development of tools that manage the procurement and implementation phases of the project. And some of the ones that I've worked with, if you're familiar with sites such as eBay and things like that, it's almost the same. You can go in, you've got a catalogue, select from the catalogue, click on it, click authorization, put in a password, and it's purchased and delivered. Online tools for procurement now give the buyers a single point where procurements can be advertised and provide sellers with a single source to provide procurement documents and complete directly online. And usually they will have multiple vendors, and that allows you, if it's a standard sort of item, you can actually compare and contrast from the different vendors to get the best deal for your company. But always remember to check two things. Number one is delivery included, often it's not, and number two, the delivery time or the lead time, because sometimes you might get a good deal, or it seems, from one supplier, but you check and you find it's maybe 3 weeks delivery. A slightly more expensive one may be there by the end of the week. So things like that you have to balance as a project manager. Writing contracts that allocate specific risks to the buyer or seller. The buyer will be required to accept the risks that the contractors do not have control over. For example, there could be a change in legislation for tax or whatever. Obviously, the seller has got no control over that, so therefore, unfortunately, the buyer has to accept those sort of things. In mega projects, the use of internationally recognized standard contract forms is increasingly in order to reduce problems and claims during execution. Logistics and supply chain management. In the IT field in particular, a long lead item may require ordering 2 to 3 months in advance. In complex construction projects, long lead items may require ordering 1, 2, 3 or more years in advance. For these projects, long lead items can be procured in advance of other procurement contracts to meet the planned project completion date. It's possible to begin contracting for these long lead materials, supplies or equipment before the final design of the end product itself is completed, based on the known requirements identified in the top level design. In Western Australia, for example, there's a sports stadium being built, and they required a bridge to go to the stadium, and that bridge was ordered 3 years before the plan was finished for the stadium, because of the amount of time it would take to make it in the other country and transport it across. Increased scrutiny of publicly funded projects. These can include webcams in a building site so that stakeholders can see what is actually happening. Many times I've been employed under contract and a lot of the work I've done could easily have been performed remotely from the office or from home. But generally I worked on a customer's site, even though that was less efficient because I had to travel there and back, which was wasted time, but I knew this gave them assurance that I was actually working. Trial engagements. Organisations may effectively put sellers on probation by procuring minor deliverables from a number of different sellers and then choosing the provider for the major work after they've seen how they perform on the small ones. This means the project can start before the final provider has been selected. There is no time lost on the project because we were getting minor deliverables produced and the risk has been reduced by testing the providers in the field. That brings us to the end of Project Procurement Management Module Overview. The next lesson is 12.1, Plan Procurement Management. Please read the corresponding chapter of the PMBOK guide before watching this video. You have procured the PMBOK guide, you might as well use it.